Hello, and welcome back to the Pluralist Podcast, where we talk about Judaism, democracy, and the struggle for a just, equal, and inclusive Israel. And today we're going to talk about the role of the Supreme Court in Israel and the U.S. and the struggle to protect our democracies. For almost 3 years, we have been fighting to protect Israeli democracy. In December of 2022, the Netanyahu government was inaugurated and immediately declared war on the rule of law. It has been working since to subordinate the gatekeepers who represent the checks and balances on the power of the government, most notably the Supreme Court and the Attorney General. The government is advancing these changes to the very foundation of the State of Israel without popular mandate. Our massive protests, the largest in Israel's history, have been an uphill battle against what can only be described as a legal coup. The government's ability to advance this coup revealed how weak Israel's systems of checks and balances is. The only body that can really put the brakes on the government's power is our Supreme Court. As we demonstrated, we looked at other legal systems as reference points. First and foremost, the American system. We pointed out that the U.S. system has checks and balances which ensure separation of powers. And indeed, at face value, the American system seemed to present a strong democracy, very different from ours. Israel does not have a written constitution, only a set of basic laws that can be changed all too easily. In contrast, the U.S. Constitution has withstood the test of time over more than 200 years and is amended only by broad consensus. Our single-chamber Knesset is controlled by the government's coalition majority and provides little oversight of the government. In contrast, the American Congress comprises 2 houses and has the power to prevent the president from pushing forward problematic agendas. The U.S. system also includes a term limit on the presidency, while here the prime minister can conceivably rule indefinitely. The U.S. model also features a close relationship between voters and their elected representatives, giving voters a meaningful voice in its government. The Israeli government can completely ignore the electorate's will between elections. But then Trump 2.0 came to power and threw everything we thought about the strength of American democracy out of the window. It turns out that in order for rules to protect us, one needs to respect the rules. And if you discard and disregard them, it does not really matter what they say. If you undermine democratic institutions, the law becomes nothing more than a rubber stamp. Over recent months, both Trump and Netanyahu have been operating according to what Princeton professor Scheppele calls autocratic legalism, that destroys democracy with its cynical manipulation of the law. They do so by dismantling key institutions, appointing loyalists to key positions, attacking the media and the academia, and trafficking in populist narratives that portray their opponents as unpatriotic traitors and enemies of the people. Where do the courts stand in the face of such threats? In the U.S., the conservative majority of the Supreme Court has transformed it into a body all too eager to nullify the rights they are sworn to protect. The Israeli Supreme Court has become more conservative too. Our justices have a mandatory retirement age of 70. In recent years, 3 liberal judges have retired and were not replaced by other judges since the Justice Minister refuses to convene the Judicial Appointments Committee until he gets what he wants, which is complete control of the nomination process. But our court is still seen to some degree as the bulwark protecting human and civil rights. Given the American court's recent rulings, it is hard to say this about the Supreme Court of the United States. Where does that leave us? In order to talk about the similarities and differences of the two systems, about the threats and challenges and how the legal system addresses them, I am delighted to host today Dahlia Lithwick, a dear friend, a lawyer, an award-winning journalist and author, most recently of Lady Justice, Women, the Law and the Battle to Save America. She's also a senior editor at Slate, the host of the Amicus podcast, and most notably, an expert analyst on the Supreme Court of the United States. Dahlia, it's such a pleasure to have you here today.
Orly, I learn from you every time I sit even near you. And so I'm so excited to be near your big brain, and let's see if we can solve all this together.
Yeah, we're going to try to do it. Thank you. So let's start by you telling us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up and how did you come about doing what you're doing, which is really unique?
I grew up in Ottawa, Canada. I went to college and then law school in the United States. And after law school, there was a brief period we don't talk about, which is when I lived in Reno, Nevada. I clerked for the chief judge of the Ninth Circuit. I developed a tiny little blackjack addiction. But then I immediately found myself in the unbelievably lucky position of being able to cover the Microsoft trial for Slate. And that was at the time called the trial of the century. It was a big antitrust trial. Slate was incredibly new, second online magazine in the United States. I became their legal correspondent. And after the Microsoft trial, they said, you know what, go across the street and cover the Supreme Court. And nobody had really covered the Supreme Court from a place of, I thought of myself as like a sports writer. Like I wanted to cover it as theater. I thought the justices were interesting. I thought all the sort of mystique and puffery of these, oracular great brains in a vat was not interesting to me. I just sat there and told jokes. And 26 years later, it's still my job.
Oh, amazing. And you really have been covering the Supreme Court for so long. And what can you tell us about the court's evolution during this really long time? Was there a particular moment that you recognized either in real time or in hindsight as a watershed moment, maybe a few of those?
Look, the U.S. Supreme Court is in some ways the opposite of the Israeli Supreme Court. And one of the key ways, and I think you flicked at this in your introduction, Orly, is that it is the most mystified, reified institution in the United States government. So I briefly taught at Hebrew U Law School a few years ago, and when I was trying to explain to my students there that the justices are seen as like gods who walk among us, like brains in vats, the smartest 9 jurists in the world, my students laughed because there's no such mystification or, the idea that the justices of the Israeli Supreme Court are perfect in every single way. It's laughable. So I think one of the things, and I know we'll talk about this in a minute, one of the things that's hard in the United States is to get people to puncture that sense that the court is simply a quasi-religious, oracular institution. It's the opposite, nachon? And so it's so interesting to me because what I have witnessed in my career is these moments when that gets punctured, right? And so, for instance, in 2016, Justice Antonin Scalia, probably the court's signature conservative thinker, dies. Barack Obama names someone to replace him, and this is sounding very familiar to you. The Republicans simply refuse to give Merrick Garland a hearing. They refuse to confirm him. They make up some pretextual, blah, blah, blah. It's Obama's last year in office, right? So that was a moment at which you saw them using processes, political processes, to change the composition of the court. Very, very briefly after, Amy Coney Barrett replaces Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now the voting has already started in the next election, right? By their pretextual analysis, you can't possibly seat Justice Barrett before the 2020 election, but boom, she's on the court. Again, abusing the processes, the legal processes to affect the confirmation. And then I think the arc sort of continues, the reversal of Roe v. Wade with very, very bad originalism. And then, I think we get to a year ago right now when the court signs off on this presidential immunity decision that's plucked from nowhere. There's no history in the Constitution. There's no provision that says that the president is immune from criminal prosecution. Boom. By a 6-3 conservative supermajority, it ends. And that opens the door for not just Trump not to be prosecuted, but for the election. And that's really continued into this term. In many ways, this past term we just finished has been the most partisan, political, if Trump wants it, he gets it, with a little bit of bargaining in the middle from the center of the court. But I think that the notion that the court is this mystical, perfect bestower of judgment is now completely gone. And we see that in the polling numbers. But I also think, and this is probably where I would just end this thought, that they were really good at hiding it before. The 9 justices. And what we have really seen and what is deeply damaging to the integrity of the judicial branch is that it's now flagrant, it's partisan, the dissents are ugly, the attacks on one another are ugly. It's as though the justices themselves have given up the illusion that they're oracles in robes. They're just partisan, sort of, white knuckle fighters.
Oh, it's so interesting. I have 1,000 thoughts and questions I want to ask you, but I want to start with saying that here in Israel, despite that, the fact that we rely on the courts, and when you're saying, let's puncture this illusion, I'm really afraid because what do we have other than the courts here? We have nothing. So we still have to rely on the courts. And as always, what you have just described is you are a few steps ahead of us. Usually we come, the processes here occur after they occur in America. And I want to ask you this appoint. Is there a lesson that you think we can learn from your experience, from the court being super, super conservative and super, super political? I mean, we're a few steps behind. No, we're not that far behind. But what can we do to prevent this really long-term conservative capture of the judiciary, which is it has unbelievable repercussions on the American legal system and definitely on the Israeli legal system, which lacks any other checks and balances on the power of the government?
So I think a couple of things, and they're important things. One is it's really important to be clear, and this pains me. I come at this as a lawyer the way you do. And I'm well aware that we need to have functioning courts. And critics of the U.S. Supreme Court that come at it from the left are not there to burn it down, because I am as aware as you are that in the absence of courts, in the absence of fair processes and jurisprudence, right, it's just fighting on the streets. And that never redounds to the benefit of the kinds of vulnerable communities that the courts are supposed to serve. So I want to be very, very clear that I am here for the courts in much the same way you are. But critics of the United States Supreme Court would say, look, this was baked in, flawed from the beginning, right, in ways that the Israeli Supreme Court is not. There's no term limits. There's no age limits. There are no ethics rules, we learned in the last couple of years, right, when we've had justices flying around not
disclosing. There are no ethic rules for judges?
Every other Article III judge is bound by enforceable ethics rules. The 9 justices of the U.S. Supreme Court say that they are, wait for it, advisory as to them. Like the way looking at a menu is advisory. I think I'll have the Kung Pao chicken.
Unbelievable.
So they can't be enforced. And so what we've seen in the last couple of years is justices, taking out massive loans, right? Clarence Thomas, his mother's home is paid for by somebody who's got business before the court. Samuel Alito went on a salmon fishing trip with someone who had a case before the court. They don't disclose it. This is determined later by journalism. And that's a huge problem, right? So I think we make the category error of saying this is the best constitutional democracy in the world. It's not. It's full of problems. And I would say, and this really goes to, I think, one of your questions about the court as a kind of counter-majoritarian check on democracy. The U.S. Supreme Court is so counter-majoritarian that it now serves the Federalist Society, right? It serves a tiny, tiny cabal of very, very interested, largely big donors. But also, and this is also not got a parallel in Israel, the U.S. Supreme Court, again, by design, is now 5 of the 6 conservatives in the 6-justice supermajority have been seated by presidents who lost the popular vote, right, because of the Electoral College, and then confirmed by a Senate in which South Dakota has as many senators as California, right? So you have a counter-majoritarian institution, presumably, in which a minority-majority president, right, seats the justice, a minority-majority Senate confirms the justice, and those same justices go on to do Shelby County and Rusho and votes that constrict and cases that constrict the vote. So you now have an almost perfect circle of minority rule with no check on that. So essentially what happened is the conservative legal movement in America for 50 years, going back to the so-called Lewis Powell memo, figured out how to reverse engineer that and take control of the court. And if you look at all those problems in the system, it's really easy to reverse engineer it to make it a minority-majority institution that makes it harder and harder and harder for democracy to work. That's the system. That is by design, in some sense, by the framers that created a court that could never be representative. And now that's been exploited. The Israeli Supreme Court does not suffer from those problems. And so I think one of the things to think about when you think about how to wrest control back is what it means when 10.5% of the population is on the streets protesting something so abstract as an independent judiciary. Americans not only wouldn't protest that, they have no idea what that would mean. And so I think the huge advantage, and I used to say this the whole year of the judicial reform protests, the huge advantage is to have some sense that an independent, free judiciary that can do the right thing matters. I don't think in the United States that ever pierced public consciousness, maybe until Roe v. Wade was overturned. And that's the big advantage that I think people understand. In terms of what we do about huge money, flooding systems, in this case, this is the Orban playbook, right? We capture the judiciary. The same people who helped Orban capture the judiciary in Hungary were certainly instrumental in the Trump judicial capture and here as well. And so I think that we have a much larger question than any atomized Supreme Court. I think we have an international authoritarian movement, and you described Kim Scheppele's. We think that authoritarianism comes in tanks. Right. It doesn't. It comes in with justices. That's the thing that we have to think about, much more so than the nuance of, how exactly a judicial reform is going to work.
So you mentioned really the politicization of the court and the fact that the question, how is it susceptible to public pressure? You mentioned the pro-democracy protest in Israel, and I think that it is really amazing. It's unprecedented both on an Israeli level and worldwide. And actually tomorrow there is planned a huge protest in support of the current Attorney General, who was fired by the government in advance of a Supreme Court hearing on this Wednesday, so 2 days from today. And I want to ask you, do you think that public pressure influences judges, both in Israel and the States? You did mention, you think here in Israel it makes a difference. Doesn't it make a difference in the States? Because as you say, a lot of the issues that the Supreme Court decides in America today are against the popular will, right? The majority of Americans are, for, pro-choice. And in other issues, doesn't it make a difference for the judges in the States?
If we'd been having this conversation 2 years ago, Orly, I would have said not only does it make a difference, but for people like Chief Justice John Roberts, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, the so-called center of the court, that it makes an enormous difference, that they care not just about prestige of the court and the idea that the court is this, immutable, perfect thing. They care about their own legacies. And John Roberts is famous for, I imagine him brushing his teeth every morning and being like, I'm the greatest Chief Justice in the world. Like, that's important to him. Since the immunity decision came down, I think that's clearly wrong. I think that they have taken the position that they're on Team Trump, and whether that means this is the last free and fair election in the United States, and I'm not overstating it, and there's a huge voting rights case that's on the docket for this fall that may do away with what's left of the Voting Rights Act after the court hacked it apart in Shelby County. I think that there is a non-trivial chance that the 6 justices in the conservative supermajority don't care what the public think. And I want to say something that is slightly less grim, because that's a pretty grim, emphatic statement. I think that the American public sometimes misunderstands the lesson of FDR's court packing, right? FDR was going to do exactly the kind of judicial reform that we were fighting here in Israel. And the lesson there is that the most popular president in American history almost blows his legacy by trying to add seats to the court. That's not the end of the story, though, because what really happened is that a bunch of the conservative justices who were blocking his New Deal initiatives either quit the court or switched sides and started to uphold them. So I think the actual truth of that story is that not just that public pressure mattered in that case, but that if you force the court's hand, sometimes the court blinks. Sometimes it does. And I think for some reason, because Americans have such an acute case of sort of Patty Hearst syndrome, they're so in love with the idea that the court is perfect and untouchable. They tell the other story, which is we tried court packing, it didn't work. That's not the story. The story is immense focused public pressure can, I think, make a difference. And so really, I think we are in a moment right now, and I say this with great regret, where Joe Biden had 4 years in which he could have done court reform. And instead, as you know, he impaneled this blue ribbon commission to study court reform, and nothing was done. And so the real lesson is it is so unbelievably easy to lose democracy. It is so unbelievably easy to squander judicial supremacy and judicial sobriety. And the United States gave it away. They gave it away. And I think there is time in Israel still to fight for it. But the idea that this is a problem we can think about in 7 years or 9 years is, I really do believe, at that point you are really sweeping back the sea. The moment to think very seriously about how to protect the court's integrity is now.
Yesterday. I think here we do see that our Supreme Court has become, even on the one hand, even more cautious, sort of deciding to pick his struggles because he's under such an unbelievable scrutiny and criticism by the government for many, many years. On the other hand, I sometimes feel that they're like, okay, they're against us anyway. We'll go all the way in some cases. So it could go really both ways. And I do believe that the public support of all of the gatekeepers, not only the Supreme Court justices, even the legal advisors of the committees in the Knesset, we are there, we are helping them raise a voice for democracy and trying to block dangerous initiatives. I think it really makes a difference. It's important for us. It's important for them to feel they're not alone. I'm wondering really what happened, though, in the states that has changed so much. You mentioned how we persuaded people in 2023 to understand what's actually at stake here in the legal coup, and it took a while because most Israelis had no idea what our legal system is about, that we don't have a real constitution, that basic laws could be changed very easily. Most Israelis had no idea that it could change overnight, and it took a while to sort of educate the public. And we are actually recording on September 1st, the first day of school in Israel, and I think public education is super important, both in Israel and the States, for people to understand that we need a strong court and we need a democratic court that upholds our rights and values in order to protect all of our rights. And I couldn't understand why the government of Israel is doing this because, today you have the power. Tomorrow you are not going to have the power. You will need someone to protect you against the majority. And so I think this basic education of what a democracy is so essential. I mean, people don't know it, don't know enough. And I wonder, what do you think about, civic education in the States? I mean, do people talk about it? Is it something that's being spoken about, that this is maybe one of the key solutions to this unbelievable populist narrative that is going on both in Israel and the States and elsewhere in the world?
I think it goes back to where we started in some sense, Orly, which is that the American public generally has the most acute case of learned helplessness around the courts that I have ever experienced. And I think it is partly a function of having a court that is that old. I mean, don't forget, and this is important, by design, if you read the Federalist Papers, the court in the United States is the weakest branch, right? It has no army, it has no budget, it has nothing, right? And that was by design. Neither the power of the purse nor the sword. The only power it has is public legitimacy. What it won, absolutely hook, line, and sinker, is public legitimacy. The American people, starting, after the 1970s, after impeachable Warren, after some of that, the court really understood that public legitimacy was not something to squander. And I think part of the change that we saw with the voting rights cases, with Dobbs, with the sort of raft of anti-LGBTQ cases we're seeing, with the unbelievable, horrifying language in some of the judicial decisions that we're seeing now that is going after district court judges. We've never seen justices attacking district court judges as lawless until, really in the last couple of months. And so what I think is happening now is this very compressed in a very small amount of time American public recognition, and you see it in the polling, of like, oh wait, they're not, this is the Wizard of Oz. Like, the little guy behind the curtain is just a little guy behind the curtain. They're not perfect. They're not great. They're just partisans. And it actually matters, I think, for the legitimacy of the court in the United States, that for the first time in many decades, all the liberals are appointed by Democrats, all the conservatives are appointed by Republicans. It is exactly what it looks like. And so on this question of public education, and this is an issue that kind of across the boards, Justices Anthony Kennedy and Sandra Day O'Connor, Ginsburg and Justice Scalia all talked about the ways in which the American public doesn't fully understand the court. And as a consequence, they don't take seriously how fragile judicial legitimacy is. And I guess what I'm saying is that has had years and years of being kind of baked in amber. And so it's much more shocking for Americans to be like, wait, what? The court did a thing? I guess there's nothing to do about it. The court is perfect. And I think that in some sense that really is the superpower that the Israeli protest movement has had. Nobody ever thought that, not for 5 seconds, and nobody thinks it now. And it's unfortunate the consequence is the same, right? An erosion of legitimacy and an erosion of understanding. There is an immutable thing called the rule of law. These values are important, but the upside surely is that the public knows when political games are being played, and the American public, I think, has no idea when political games are being played.
It's really interesting because you're saying on the one hand, we have to convince the public that democracy, the rule of law, separation of powers is super important. On the other hand, in America, we have to be able to criticize the court when it's problematic. In Israel, as I said, I think it's the other way around. We have to keep our courts from being criticized too harshly because it affects their legitimacy. And when we're talking about numbers, our Supreme Court has been the subject of severe criticism by the current government and former governments for many years, who have tried to portray a picture of the court running the country against the majority of most Israelis, which is complete nonsense. I mean, as someone who has been litigating before the Israeli Supreme Court for many years, the court has been very, very cautious and trying to be very polite toward the government, toward the Knesset, and only intervenes when they don't really have a chance, right? Because we had petitions that have been pending before the court for 15, even 20 years because the Knesset didn't do anything, or the government, and so they had to intervene. But when we talk about public legitimacy and the effect of the politicization of the court, it's interesting to note that while the public trust in our Supreme Court has declined, it's still much higher than in other governments. I saw just in a recent poll, around 40% or 42% of Israelis feel they trust the Supreme Court, in contrast to 25% trusting the government, which is still very high in my opinion. It's surprising, and 16% trust the Knesset. So I don't know what's the case in America about the public trust and the legitimacy of the court that you touch a little bit.
The numbers are lower than they've ever been since Gallup started polling. Wow. And the numbers that came out this August, the approval rating, which is actually similar to the Israeli one, the approval rating for the U.S. Supreme Court is at 39% now, which is the lowest since they started doing it, which tells you how respected the court was, right? That's plummeting approval rating. And then those same polls that came out in August said that, again, Congress, approvals like 18%, says The Economist. YouGov poll, Gallup says 26%. Donald Trump's job performance, Quinnipiac says 40%, Gallup says 37%, Economist YouGov 42%. So Donald Trump, again, perplexingly, in August still has pretty high approval rates. But I think that the important thing is, if you think about the fact that those numbers will spike up again, right? Because all you need is a different president, all you need is a different Congress. The court can't win it back. When the court gives it away, it takes, and Justice Stephen Breyer wrote 2 books about this, it takes decades, if not centuries, to win it back. And again, the only way you can enforce your rulings as a court is the public saying, as they did after Bush v. Gore, right? In the 2000 election, where the court just announces, Bush wins, everybody go home. Everybody went home. They hated it. Citizens United, right? Yeah. The campaign finance ruling, everybody across partisan lines hated it. They went home. That is not a given. And so I think that what we are both saying in different ways, and maybe let me pull on one other thing that you're saying, this is the most interesting thing about this. These are absolutely opposite imperatives, right? Because the progressive movement in the United States is trying to reform the court, right? The move is to add seats and add ethics rules and have term limits. So they want to do structural reform, which is exactly the thing that is being fought here. And so it is not, I think it's hard to understand that as anything but cynical, but it's not in fact cynical. It's 2 sides of the same coin, which is, again, if you use Kim Scheppele's construction of the problem, which is we are ushering in autocracy by way of the judicial branch. This is 2 different attacks on the same problem.
Yeah, for sure. We are getting close to the end of this episode. It went by so quickly. But I want to ask you really toward the end, what can we do in the face of really those unbelievable threats to both our democracies that really both of them have reached a peak? And it seemed that Netanyahu and Trump are really teaching each other, each one, a crazy, more dangerous measures. And what do you think we can do? I mean, are there strategies that liberals in both of our countries can use in order to try, to defend our democracies?
So I think you touched on probably the most important one, which is public education. And it's really tricky in a moment where, we talked about the dismal approval numbers for the courts and for government. Those are the approval numbers for the press, my job, for lawyers, your job. We are in deep trouble because I think we're in a moment of great nihilism and cynicism. So I think one of the things we have to do is figure out ways, and that's why we're doing this podcast, right? Trusted messengers saying the truth is liquid gold right now. It is the most important thing we can do to preserve democracy. Again, you go back to the Orban playbook, going after the press. I know it's happened here. I know it's happening in the United States. That's important. important, right? A free and fair press and people trusting the press. The other thing I would just say, and I really believe this like in my bones, Orly, is that we have a problem of believing that democracy happens like out there. And like some guy, it's always a guy in a white hat on a white horse is going to come in and he's going to fix it. And he's always got a white hat and a white horse. And we just wait for him, right? And we like get on YouTube and watch videos. And what I absolutely believe, and I know you believe because you live it, is that's not how change has ever happened in the world. Change happens because we look around and we realize like we're the guy in the white hat on the white horse. And like we have to be doing it. We have to make democracy a daily, if not hourly muscle, and understand, just like to end on Kimberly Scheppele again, that when you are in moments, when you are in peril of tilting into autocracy, your job is to put friction in the system. Your job is to put sand in the gears. You probably can't single-handedly save the Israeli Supreme Court, but you can put friction in the gears. You can stand up for the Attorney General. You can stand up for the justices. You can do this. And I think that what we are seeing, at least in Israel right now, which is people who still, even though they're standing there on the streets and they're like, I don't know why I'm doing this. Why are we here? I guess something. That is more than just sitting and waiting. And so I really, really believe that if you look at at least in the United States, post-Reconstruction, post-Jim Crow, the civil rights movement, every one of those movements is not powered by waiting for somebody. It's being the somebody. And that really has to be, as I said, once you've lost it, you can see Poland clawing it back. Once you've lost it, it's hard to get it back. And so we have to be awake and realize that the thing that stands between losing it and never getting it back is us.
Yeah, and not being indifferent. And I completely agree with your optimistic note, which is a great way to end our episode. I think we have the power to change, and I think we have to remember that things have changed over time, that a lot of processes over history began and then changed because of what people did and have done. And I want to thank you for all you've been doing, for your amazing analysis over the years, and for everything you've said here today, which was really an eye-opener for me and I'm sure for our listeners. So thank you so much for coming. And thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll see you again in the next episodes. Bye-bye.